A millionaire abandoned his daughter and her mother on the highway. 20 years later, the daughter came back, determined to turn his life into a living hell. The wind blew fiercely that afternoon when the roar of passing cars barely broke the silence of the deserted highway. Rick Brown, 35 years old, drove with a furrowed brow, swerving around potholes as though they might distract him from the argument he was having with Elena, 25. In the back seat, little Jessica, 5, watched with wide eyes the looks of resentment her parents hurled at each other. Rick complained about expenses, fatigue, frustrated ambitions. Elena, her voice trembling, insisted they shouldn't continue like this, that they had a daughter to care for. What began as a simple exchange of reproaches soon escalated in volume and cruelty. Rick pulled the car over to the side of the road, empty for miles around. His hands shook as he grabbed his keys and got out, slamming the door, ignoring Elena, who began to cry. Jessica, terrified, silently watched the scene from the window. The man opened the passenger door and demanded Elena get out with the child. At first, she refused, but Rick's shouts became unbearable, so piercing that Jessica burst into tears. With her forehead beaded with sweat, Elena got out, clutching her daughter's hand tightly. When she tried to stop Rick by pleading that he not abandon them, he responded with a slight push that forced her back. A cloud of dust rose as a speeding car whizzed by, nearly grazing the edge of her jacket. Rick, in a fit seemingly laced with hatred and exhaustion, shoved Elena again. Then he straightened his tie and got back into the car. "I warned you this wouldn't last," he muttered coldly. "This is over." With that final remark, he started the engine, stepped on the gas, and disappeared around the bends of the highway, leaving Elena and little Jessica covered in dust and tears. For a few seconds, only the rush of the wind and the little girl's sobs could be heard. She clung to her mother in despair. Barely able to stand, Elena lifted Jessica in her arms and tried to find some shelter. But the afternoon wore on mercilessly, and they were alone, not knowing if anyone would pick them up before darkness closed in completely. That moment was etched forever in Jessica's memory. Over time, the images of the receding car and her father's tense hand on the steering wheel became a recurring nightmare, one that woke her up drenched in sweat. Many years later, Jessica jerked upright in her small bed, gasping as though she'd just run a marathon. Even though 2 decades had passed, her heart still shrank at the memory of Rick's last look when he abandoned her. She opened her eyes, making out the meager outlines of her room. Stains of dampness marred the walls, and on a small table nearby stood the bottle of heart medicine for her mother. Dawn was breaking. A timid ray of sunlight slipped through the curtains, casting shadows on the worn-out carpet. Jessica took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She knew the memories wouldn't leave her alone, but she was also convinced that someday she would make him pay for every tear they had shed. She stood and went to the adjacent room, where her mother, Elena, 45, was sleeping. The lines on Elena's face and the weary gleam in her eyes revealed the battles she had fought. When Jessica drew closer, she noticed her mother's irregular breathing. The heart disease had worsened over the years, and each day posed a bigger challenge. Still, Elena never stopped smiling tenderly at her, reminding her that life was more than just resentment and pain. That morning, sensing her daughter's presence, Elena slowly opened her eyes and forced a worried expression. "Another nightmare, my love?" she asked in a weak voice. Jessica only nodded and stroked her mother's hand. Whenever she remembered the abandonment, an unquenchable fire ignited inside her. Though on the surface she seemed gentle and calm, deep down she harbored an intense desire to settle the score with Rick Brown. After making herself a simple cup of coffee, Jessica sat at the small kitchen table, where a few newspaper and magazine clippings were scattered about. She had spent weeks investigating the political rise of the man she so despised. Rick Brown was now running for governor of his state, appearing on covers and in news reports, always with a perfect smile and speeches filled with promises. If not for the tormenting memories and the little help he had once given, anyone would have thought Rick was a good Samaritan. Jessica, however, knew the true face of that politician and was not willing to let him keep climbing without paying for what he'd done. She was well aware that behind those publicity campaigns and grins for the cameras, he was the same coward who had abandoned them on the highway. She studied the photos of his rallies and the headlines about the upcoming elections, a tight knot forming in her throat, while a plan began to take shape in her mind. She took one last sip of coffee and glanced at her mother's medicine bottle. Affording the expensive drugs was a monumental effort for their meager finances. Often, Jessica racked her brain looking for a new job or a stroke of luck, but nothing came quickly enough. She didn't tell Elena to spare her further worry, yet she knew a well-executed revenge might also solve their financial woes. Her desire for her mother to receive proper treatment and her pent-up anger toward Rick merged in her mind. She recalled the rainy days when Elena worked non-stop just to put some food on Jessica's plate, enduring the pain of betrayal all the while. She recalled the long bus rides, the doors that were slammed shut in their faces each time they sought a chance at stability. All of it pushed her to take the final step. She ran her fingertips over the newspaper clippings, pausing on a headline announcing Rick Brown's imminent candidacy. Not only had he shirked his paternal responsibility, but now he was aiming for a position of power that would let him manipulate hundreds of people. Jessica's heart pounded. She wouldn't let him escape his own history. Finally, Jessica stood with resolve. She went to her mother's room, where Eleanor dozed fitfully. Before leaving, she gently adjusted the sheet and placed some coins on the nightstand for whatever was needed that day. Then she headed to the door, picking up her bag filled with clippings and notes. The day was just beginning, and Jessica could already feel the weight of the future on her shoulders. But this time she refused to be crushed by the darkness of memory. It was time to face everything. Her father, who had abandoned her without a second thought, would discover that the defenseless little girl from the past was ready to settle unfinished business. Thus, with the indelible image of the dusty highway and the outline of the car vanishing into the distance, Jessica left her apartment. She knew her life was about to change course. She was going to find Rick, and this time there would be no mercy. Vengeance had become her driving force, and the Brown family's fate would be forever marked by that unforgivable act committed so many years ago, leaving them stranded in the middle of nowhere. Rick Brown's campaign gained momentum within weeks, becoming a phenomenon that dominated headlines and opinion columns in the local press. His speeches resonated in crowded plazas, where men and women applauded him enthusiastically. He had the ability to promise security, jobs, and economic stability, painting a prosperous future for anyone who trusted him. His team of advisors, dressed in sober suits and armed with folders full of data, surrounded him like a protective ring. They were willing to sacrifice the media image for that electoral victory. At every rally, Rick appeared calm, flashing calculated smiles under bright lights and deafening applause. His impeccable image and the growing popularity in the polls fed the certainty that he was one step ahead of his competitors. Every afternoon, a new commercial aired on television, praising his public career and the supposed good deeds he was pushing forward. People were starting to believe that he was the leader the state needed. Jessica followed every move of Rick through the news, digital newspapers, and live-streamed conferences. She jotted down dates, names, and places in a notebook that had become her personal journal of revenge. She knew that to get to him, simply hating him wouldn't be enough. It was crucial to understand his power structure and, above all, his allies. It was then that she discovered the name of Pedro Cortázar, a businessman almost as influential as Rick, but far more feared for his unclear methods of financing. Once she had the first clues about who Cortázar was, Jessica dived into researching his profile. She read old articles that linked him to alleged acts of corruption and money laundering suspicions. Nothing had been confirmed, but the press described him as a man capable of moving mountains in exchange for political favors. Through her virtual magnifying glass, Jessica found photos of Rick and Cortázar exchanging knowing glances at charity galas and official ceremonies. It was clear they were part of a powerful partnership that operated with total impunity. At the same time, Jessica kept a close eye on Rick's rival, Karl Moran. Although Moran was also running strongly for the governorship, Rick's advertising machine had surpassed him, pushing him several points ahead in the polls. However, Moran had a campaign team ready to expose the truth behind his opponent's secret deals. This media fight, full of accusations, worked in Jessica's favor, as she planned to use all that tension to cover her own moves. Days passed in a frenzy of news and rumors, and while Jessica advanced in her research, Eleanor suffered another health setback. That afternoon, Jessica found her mother lying on the kitchen floor, barely conscious, breathing erratically with a pained expression on her face. With her heart in her throat, Jessica rushed to hold her mother, barely managing to carry her to the bedroom. She immediately called for emergency services, and soon an ambulance stopped in front of the modest building where they lived. At the hospital, the attending physician explained to Jessica that her mother needed continuous, more specialized treatment than what they had been providing. If the heart episodes weren't controlled with constant care, Eleanor's life would be in danger. Jessica felt trapped. The money she earned from her low-paying job barely covered the basic expenses. With each relapse, the amount they needed grew overwhelmingly. After the crisis, Jessica spent hours in the waiting room, staring blankly at the floor tiles. She repeated over and over that this man, Rick, needed to pay, not just for the suffering he had caused, but also for the daily anguish that pushed her mother to the brink of death. She knew that if she managed to infiltrate his campaign, she could do two things at once: destroy her father's reputation and gain access to the resources necessary to cover Elena's treatment. Jessica's determination became resolute. That night, she left the hospital with an embryonic plan in mind: to use her knowledge of communication and her cunning to infiltrate Rick's team. If she played her cards right, she could earn the trust of some intermediary, perhaps even Cortázar himself, as long as she knew how to do it without raising suspicion immediately. She spent the next few days preparing false references and crafting a solid professional narrative. Although her studies in political marketing hadn't been formal, she had the ability to persuade and project confidence. In addition, she had an invaluable resource: her personal experience with Rick's cruelty, which would allow her to anticipate his reactions and influence him without raising alarms. Meanwhile, the news broadcasts announced a rise in Brown's polling numbers, positioning him at the top of the rankings. Karl Moran's supporters protested on opinion forums, accusing Rick of being corrupt and manipulative. In this political turmoil, Jessica saw the perfect opportunity to get close. The campaign teams were in need of personnel to fine-tune strategies, respond to media attacks, and design last-minute tactics. Even though the thought of facing the man who had abandoned her made her stomach churn, Jessica knew there was no more effective path than infiltration. Doing it from the outside, with public denouncements and complaints, wouldn't work. Rick had gained too much influence for the truth to even touch him. The only way to bring down his castle of illusions was from the inside, gradually dismantling it with irrefutable proof. At dusk, Jessica returned to the hospital to give her mother the last visit of the day. Elena was resting, still pale, but determined not to give up. Jessica looked at her silently. She knew that sooner or later she would have to explain her next steps to her mother. However, she didn't want her to bear any more worries. In the hallway, she gazed out the window at the illuminated city. She felt small, but also brave. With every breath, she recalled the unbearable heat of the day she was abandoned on the highway. That image of herself, just a helpless little girl, fueled her conviction that so much injustice couldn't be tolerated. Her pulse raced. In her mind, the path was clear: infiltrate Rick's campaign, gather evidence, and when the time was right, expose him to the media and the entire society. In doing so, she would also secure the income needed to afford her mother's treatments. ensuring that Elena regained the health that was slipping through her fingers. She left the hospital with a deep sigh, adjusting her jacket. The cold of the night was a harbinger of the difficulties ahead, but also a call to action. The next morning, she would begin her offensive against the man who, without a shred of remorse, had stolen their peace 20 years ago. No more fear. The time for revenge had come. Jessica arrived right on time at the building where Rick Brown's campaign was being coordinated. The place was a hive of frantic activity, staffers clutching portfolios, phones ringing off the hook, and an atmosphere charged with electoral urgency. As she walked through the glass doors, she noticed the bright overhead lights and the sound of footsteps mingling with hushed, confidential conversations. This setting perfectly matched the ambition pulsing through every corner. She took a deep breath and headed for the reception desk, introducing herself in the most confident voice she could muster. She stated she was a political communications consultant and presented an impeccably prepared file filled with fictitious yet plausible references. Behind the desk, a young woman reviewed the documents and asked her to wait. Jessica sat down, feigning calm as she glanced at campaign posters bearing Rick's smiling face, the very man she so despised. A few minutes later, Gabriel Ferrer, the campaign manager, emerged from a side hallway. He was a serious-looking man with thick-rimmed glasses and an aura of constant tension. Holding a folder brimming with charts, he gave a brief nod and beckoned for Jessica to follow. They climbed a flight of stairs, walked down a narrow corridor, and finally reached a makeshift conference room. A rectangular table stood at the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs, with a silent projector at the far end. "All right, Miss Martinez, correct?" Gabriel asked, quickly skimming through Jessica's folder. "That's right. A pleasure to meet you, Mr. Ferrer," she replied, holding his gaze with carefully practiced composure. Gabriel took a seat across from her, arranging the documents atop his temporary desk. Without small talk, he delved straight into her knowledge of public opinion analysis, crisis management, and counter-campaign strategy. Jessica answered effortlessly, citing examples of non-existent cases she had concocted beforehand. To sound convincing, she supported every response with data and figures from previous campaigns, making sure not to slip up and reveal her deception. The interview went on for nearly half an hour. Little by little, Gabriel's tense jaw began to loosen, though he never broke into a genuine smile. Before concluding, he looked at her intently. "I appreciate your time, Jessica. If you really have the experience you say you do, we might give you a shot," he said, still sounding non-committal. "However, the candidate wants to meet key people in person." Jessica held her breath. She knew that meeting Rick in person was the crucial step to landing a position on the campaign. She nodded politely and, after crossing the hallway again, settled in another, smaller waiting area. From there, she could hear low voices coming from inside an office. 10 long minutes passed before the door opened and a man stepped out, tie askew, muttering something about schedules and agendas. Right after, Gabriel reappeared and motioned for Jessica to enter. Rick Brown's office was spacious and bright, featuring a large window with a view of the city. Standing at the back of the room, Rick studied a board covered with notes, poll figures, and state maps. When he saw her come in, curiosity flickered in his eyes, but he did not recognize her. After all, it had been 20 years since he'd abandoned her. "Mr. Brown, this is Jessica Martinez, an expert in political communications," Gabriel announced formally. Rick looked her up and down. He had the bearing of someone used to giving orders, his expression still carrying that rigid air Jessica remembered from childhood. A shiver raced down her spine, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Pleased to meet you, Jessica," he said, extending his hand. She shook it firmly, hiding the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Immediately, Rick gestured toward the board, pointing out the key aspects of his campaign. He discussed the challenge of continuous criticism from his rival, Karl Moran, and the urgency of countering attacks spreading on social media. Seizing the opportunity, Jessica rattled off several tactics she could implement, gathering favorable citizen testimonials, countering rumors with pointed statements in the press, and bolstering their presence on digital platforms. Her proposal sounded so thorough and convincing that Rick paused for a moment, clearly impressed by the clarity of her ideas. "Interesting," he said, openly showing his approval. "Gabriel, have you verified her credentials?" "I'm on it, sir," the campaign manager responded. Even so, Rick's expression hinted at a strange enthusiasm, as if he had suddenly discovered a promising ally. Meanwhile, Jessica felt a knot tighten in her throat. She was about to earn the trust of the very man she had come to destroy. The meeting ended when an assistant knocked on the door to inform them that the next press conference was about to begin. Rick invited Jessica to join him, and as they made their way to the main hall, she sensed Gabriel Ferrer's watchful gaze and the presence of Adriana, Rick's wife. Adriana, elegantly dressed, narrowed her eyes upon noticing the newly arrived young woman. No words were necessary. Her wary demeanor spoke volumes. That afternoon, an incident arose that Jessica seized upon to her advantage. A local media outlet published a report accusing Rick of nepotism in his hiring practices. The story blew up on social media, threatening to overshadow his next rally. Rick lost his composure momentarily upon hearing it, but Jessica acted swiftly, compiling documentation that partly refuted the claim and drafting a statement to address the matter within hours. "If we release it now with precise information," she explained, holding up printed pages, "we can steer the media away. We'll flip the narrative, framing it as a desperate attack by the opposition." Her plan worked. The following day, much of the news coverage focused on Rick's strong response, and the scandal fizzled out. This secured Jessica a prime spot in the campaign office. She was now viewed as a secret weapon, someone who could tackle problems effectively. With this success under her belt, Jessica's contract was formalized. Gabriel still had his reservations, feeling the whole process had moved too quickly, but Rick insisted she stay. Adriana remained polite in public, though each gesture carried an undercurrent of suspicion. Finally established in her new role, Jessica allowed herself a quiet sigh as she walked for the first time through the doors of the advisors section. She stared resolutely at the posters and campaign materials featuring her father. She had taken the first step. She was in the inner circle, ready to carry out her revenge. Certain of this, she cast aside any pangs of guilt and prepared to set in motion her plan, a plan that would inevitably shake the foundations of the Brown family. The first results of Jessica's work within Rick Brown's campaign quickly became apparent. Thanks to her strategies, every time the opposition led by Karl Moran launched a media attack, Rick's team responded with firmness and precision. Jessica had crafted a conciliatory speech, bolstered by examples of Rick's purported achievements in his political career. This formula, emphasizing closeness to the people, struck a chord with the public, causing Brown's popularity to rise in the polls. During the morning meetings, Jessica presented reports outlining the direction of social media, the most relevant headlines, and the trends in voter approval. She brought forward innovative ideas, such as short video clips featuring citizen testimonials, which not only halted Moran's attacks, but also gave the impression that Rick was a politician who was approachable and willing to listen. To Rick's own surprise, this approach generated more sympathy than traditional propaganda. In just a few days, Brown got used to consulting Jessica before announcing any stance. The fluency of her arguments convinced most of the team, although it wasn't all praise. Gabriel Ferrer, the campaign manager, watched Jessica's every move, certain that no one achieved that level of acceptance so quickly without hiding something. Even so, Rick's own directive was clear: trust his new advisor's abilities. Before long, Jessica was forced to interact with the Brown family. It happened when she was invited to an informal gathering at the candidate's home, where plans were being made for a charity event intended to enhance the campaign's image. Stepping into that spacious, elegantly decorated home, she felt a twinge of dizziness as she recalled how far it was from her own life, marked by hardship and sacrifice. It was at this gathering that she met Julius, the oldest child, who was 17. He was a teenager already showing signs of rebellion, yet when he spoke with Jessica, he seemed to set aside any pretense of indifference. Julius asked her a few questions about social media strategies and was impressed by how adeptly Jessica could summarize a marketing plan in mere seconds. He ended up confiding that he wanted to study communications and was eager to understand how politics worked from the inside. Despite the vast differences between them, Jessica noticed a sincere glimmer of curiosity in his eyes, and it moved her. Meanwhile, Alice, 15, stayed in a corner of the living room, listening to music through her headphones. Every so often, she would look up and fix her gaze on Jessica, sizing her up. After a while, the teenager approached and bluntly asked if being an advisor meant always having to look after her father. Startled, Jessica admitted that, in a way, she did have to be available almost all the time. Alice responded with a resigned sigh. She commented that Rick was rarely home and that when he was, he spent all his time on the phone or in his study going over paperwork. Jessica detected a trace of loneliness in the girl, a silent melancholy she recognized all too well. She saw herself at 5 years old, waiting for a father who would never return. That echo of the past stirred in her a hint of empathy toward Rick's children, despite her plan for revenge. The only person who didn't seem quite so pleased with Jessica's presence was Adriana, Rick's wife. Initially, she had tried to act friendly, but as Rick began relying on Jessica for every decision, unease took hold of her. She watched how the young advisor and her husband exchanged words in hushed tones, occasionally laughing or shutting themselves away to go over a speech. It made Adriana deeply uncomfortable. One evening, after a successful press conference in which Jessica played a key role, Adriana confronted her in the hallway. She asked if Jessica planned on staying in the campaign for long. Although her tone was polite, the underlying message was clear. She wanted to know just how close Jessica and Rick were getting. Jessica, calmly relying on the excuses she had already rehearsed, replied that she only aimed to contribute her professional expertise. Still, she noticed the tension on Adriana's face and realized she would have to be mindful of her scrutiny from then on. Things weren't much easier back at Jessica's home. Her mother, Eleanor, was still ill, and every time she realized that her daughter had brought in more money to cover expenses, her look of concern grew sharper. In the early hours of one morning, when Jessica returned from a long day of work, she found her mother half awake in the kitchen, sipping tea to calm her palpitations. "Where are you getting so much cash these days?" Elena asked softly. Jessica dodged the question. She explained that she was being well paid for her new job and that the money would pay for the treatment Elena so desperately needed. But Elena knew that if the funds came from a politician's campaign, especially one under fire from the opposition, it likely wasn't clean money, as she bluntly put it. The argument escalated. Jessica insisted she had no other choice. Medicine and specialized consultations were too expensive, and none of the options she had pursued offered a quick solution. Even so, Eleanor's words hit her hard. "Don't become what you despise." That phrase echoed in Jessica's mind even after her mother went back to bed. For several days, doubt grew inside Jessica. Each time Julius or Alice approached her with a blend of curiosity and warmth, she felt guilty. What would happen once her revenge plan took shape? Would Rick's children also suffer the consequences? Even so, the anger she harbored toward her father was strong enough to quash almost any hint of compassion. Meanwhile, Rick continued climbing in the polls. The success of his public events and the positive perception of his proposals weakened Moran's attacks, at least for now. He never suspected that his efficient advisor harbored such deeply rooted resentment. He merely celebrated his good fortune in having found someone capable of elevating his image. However, the threads of tension were beginning to unravel. Gabriel Ferrer, with his usual suspicion, continued trying to find any gap in Jessica's resume. Adriana, ever more skeptical, made no effort to hide her irritation at Jessica's presence in their home. And in Jessica's heart, guilt and the desire for justice fused into a perilous spiral. Thus, while Rick's star rose in the public eye, intrigue among those closest to him gathered like a storm on the horizon. Jessica tread carefully along a tightrope, determined to fulfill her quest for revenge, yet unsure whether she was losing a piece of herself in the process. The atmosphere in Rick Brown's campaign headquarters grew denser with the frequent arrival of Pedro Cortázar, a businessman who had until then remained almost in the shadows. Jessica began noticing him in closed meetings with Rick and a select few advisors, always with a serious expression and precise words. His presence was no accident. It was said that Cortázar was the campaign's most important financier, the one who not only invested money, but also demanded favors in exchange for his generosity. In one of these meetings, Jessica noticed how Cortázar quietly but bluntly reminded Rick of the amount he had spent on campaign advertising and logistics. He spoke of exaggeratedly high numbers, which suggested he was deeply entrenched in Brown's political project. He even let slip phrases that, to anyone with a hint of insight, sounded like veiled threats. "Don't forget we've made a lot of agreements, and they need to be fulfilled once we're in power." Rick, with a stiff expression, nodded without raising his voice, aware that his relationship with this man could either push him toward success or sink him if he wasn't careful. As the days passed, Jessica gathered more clues about Cortázar's shady activities. She overheard whispers of alleged dealings with ghost suppliers and rigged contracts for future public works. Money laundering from fictitious companies was mentioned, which represented a huge risk to Rick's image if it ever came to light. But for Jessica, these irregularities presented the perfect opportunity to execute her plan, expose Rick through the shared sins with his primary benefactor. At night, when she could finally retreat to her room, Jessica reviewed the information she had gathered. She felt an overwhelming need to shout to the world about the corruption festering in the campaign, but she had to be cautious. If she revealed everything at once, she would not only compromise the effectiveness of her revenge, but also put her own safety and her mother's at risk. So, she planned to meticulously document the evidence linking Rick and Cortázar. She made lists of checks, traced absurdly high bank leaks, and, above all, prepared a dossier that, when the time came, would serve as the ultimate weapon. This same need for evidence drove her to investigate Cortázar more thoroughly. Under the guise of coordinating Rick's media agenda, Jessica reviewed old contracts, suspicious invoices, and alleged donations to non-existent foundations. In one of her inquiries, she found a trail of a massive deposit that directly linked a Cortázar account to the campaign. With her heart pounding, she copied the document onto a USB drive that she always carried with her, hidden in the lining of her bag. It didn't take long for Jessica's actions to arouse Cortázar's suspicion. During a public event where Rick was announcing a new program for young entrepreneurs, Jessica slipped behind the stage to eavesdrop on a conversation between Cortázar and one of his associates. However, misfortune struck when a bodyguard caught her lingering in the restricted area. Though Jessica pretended to be looking for a lost cable, the bodyguard's sharp gaze followed her until she returned to the rest of the team. That same afternoon, Cortázar intercepted her in a quiet hallway in the campaign building. Without any formalities or pleasantries, he stood in front of her with a scowl on his face. "I've seen you snooping where you shouldn't," he murmured, in a voice so low it was chilling. "I warn you, it's not wise to stick your nose in things that don't concern you." Jessica held his gaze, resisting the urge to step back. She felt the weight of his direct threat on the back of her neck. With a slight tremor in her voice, she gave a vague reply about her job being to understand all the factors that influenced Rick's image. However, Cortázar, with an almost imperceptible gesture, made it clear that he could end her career, or even her life, if anyone got too curious. The chill that ran down Jessica's spine confirmed that she was dealing with a man who was as powerful as he was dangerous. As this new front of tension opened up, the local press began to publish rumors of corruption within Brown's campaign. A young journalist, Sylvia Contreras, aged 28, was leading the investigation. Her articles, initially discreet, pointed to financial irregularities and enigmatic names that seemed to protect the candidate's image. In a column published in an independent newspaper, Sylvia referred to suspicious bank transfers and ghost invoices linked to a prominent figure in the shadows. Jessica closely followed Sylvia's work. She watched how each day a new clue or piece of information emerged, which the young journalist was piecing together with determination. Eager to accelerate Rick's downfall and, by extension, Cortázar's, Jessica contacted Sylvia anonymously. She created a fake email account and sent a brief message with details about the campaign's modus operandi. Mentions of contracts for works not yet bid on and names of the strawmen involved. Initially skeptical, the journalist responded, asking for tangible proof. Jessica knew she needed some time to gather irrefutable documents. Meanwhile, within Rick's inner circle, the alert level increased. His closest advisors began to notice signs of leaks and feared that Sylvia's investigation might escalate into national media. Gabriel Ferrer, ever cautious, fell into a constant state of vigilance. He spent hours reviewing calls and messages in search of a potential deep throat. Rick, for his part, appeared concerned, though he kept up with his intense schedule of rallies and speeches. He relied more than ever on Jessica to manage the public scandals. However, Jessica began to feel that the shadow of Cortázar was growing ever closer. After that tense exchange, she started receiving strange calls that would immediately cut off as soon as she answered, as well as cryptic messages warning her about the consequences of continuing to investigate. Her determination, however, did not waver. She remembered the reason she was there: to ruin Rick's career and, in the process, secure the funds necessary for her mother's treatment. If giving in to intimidation meant abandoning the justice she so desperately sought, she couldn't afford to let it happen. Thus, night after night, as the campaign buzzed with rallies and interviews, Jessica secretly reviewed Cortázar's shady dealings and compiled all the evidence of corruption that could directly incriminate Rick. On the side, she kept up discreet communication with Sylvia Contreras, carefully assessing the best way to release the information without exposing herself. The tension grew, as did the risk. If Cortázar discovered her role in the leak, he could retaliate immediately. And amidst all this turmoil, Jessica felt that there was no turning back. The threads of her plan were being woven quickly, but with a level of danger she hadn't anticipated. She was beginning to understand that, to hit Rick where it would hurt the most, she would have to penetrate the very shadows where Cortázar moved freely. And though fear accompanied her every step, the thirst for vengeance outweighed any fear. No matter how threatening the situation became, it was the price she was willing to pay to destroy the man who had condemned her to a broken childhood and a present filled with scars. The squeaking of the gurney echoed through the hospital corridors as Jessica, her pulse racing, walked alongside the paramedics, transporting her mother. Elena's condition had taken an unexpected turn for the worse, a sharp pain in her chest, followed by a fainting spell that left her too weak to stand. The situation was so alarming that Jessica had no choice but to call an ambulance and rush her to the nearest clinic. In the emergency room, doctors hurried to stabilize Elena. After an hour of tests, the diagnosis was definitive. She needed a lengthy hospital stay and intensive treatment, whose cost was staggeringly high. Jessica sat in a chair outside the admissions office, her mind spinning. The insurance they had covered only the basics, and medical debts threatened to skyrocket beyond what they could possibly pay. That night, after sedating Elena to calm her down, she opened her eyes for a moment and fixed them on Jessica. The daughter understood that her mother was terrified not just for her health, but also by the financial peril looming over them. The silence was broken by the nurse coming in to administer more medication, leaving no chance to talk. Still, Eleanor's distress, her inability to protect Jessica from hardship, was evident in her defeated expression. On her way home, Jessica mentally replayed the latest events. On the one hand, she had an advanced revenge plan. She had collected valuable incriminating evidence against Rick and Pedro Cortázar. On the other, her mother stood on the edge of a fatal crisis, and money had become an urgent necessity. It was then that she made a decision she'd never thought herself capable of: to use some of the campaign's illicit funds to pay for Elena's treatment. The next morning, Jessica arrived at the campaign office with dark circles under her eyes. She'd slept barely 2 hours, and the tightness in her chest reminded her that every lost minute could be deadly for her mother. Yet she had to remain composed and discreet. Rick was busy preparing for a TV interview, rehearsing responses to the latest media attacks from Karl Moran, while his team scrambled around to handle production details. Amid the chaos, Jessica headed to the administrative area and, under the pretext of adjusting advertising expenses, requested access to an extraordinary budget supposedly meant for high-impact events. These were lightly documented funds, managed without strict formalities. The finance officer, a man with a rather bland demeanor, approved the necessary signatures without much questioning. It seemed he had orders not to resist requests from key campaign personnel, and for the moment, Jessica enjoyed Rick's trust. With a lump in her throat, she withdrew a substantial amount and transferred almost all of it to the hospital account where Elena was being treated. She knew that this act crossed her own moral boundaries, but she repeated to herself it was simply taking payment in advance for the years of abandonment, hunger, and suffering Rick had caused them. Even so, the guilt settled in her chest like an unavoidable weight. The following day, she used her lunch break to visit the hospital and make sure everything was in order. She found Elena looking somewhat more stable. Yet the moment her mother realized Jessica had suddenly paid off all the expenses, her worry became clear. "Where did you get the money?" she asked in a shaky voice. Jessica sidestepped the question with half-truths, mentioning a supposed salary advance and support from the insurer. But Elena was no fool. She knew of Rick's shady reputation and was certain that every bill Jessica spent came with a hidden catch. She simply closed her eyes, wishing she could recover enough strength to leave that place and stop her daughter before corruption consumed her entirely. Meanwhile, back at campaign headquarters, Gabriel Ferrer wasted no time noticing unusual financial movements. Reviewing the reports, he came across the recently approved special allocations and realized something didn't add up. For some time, he had suspected Jessica was hiding something about her professional background, and now the evidence of her possible misuse of funds only heightened his distrust. He began a quiet investigation into the work history Jessica had provided, tracking down the supposed consulting firms and former clients. Soon enough, he uncovered inconsistencies. Some of the companies mentioned in Jessica's resume didn't even exist, or the contacts' names didn't match the versions listed in the documents. Gabriel felt he was one step away from unmasking the ruse. At the same time, Rick Brown's marital problems were growing worse. Adriana, fed up with seeing how close her husband and Jessica had become, began privately reproaching him for his lack of attention and his endless work schedule. Stressed by Karl Moran's media attacks, Rick responded curtly, accusing her of imagining things. Such an unyielding stance only fueled their arguments and undermined the stable family image they had maintained during public appearances. As if that weren't enough, Karl Moran ramped up his smear campaign. He began presenting evidence, some partial, some more solid, of Rick's connections to dubious contractors. Each day, a new article or column highlighted apparent irregularities, casting doubt on the integrity of the poll-topping candidate. In response, Rick held a press conference, flanked by his closest team members, once again denying any link to corruption. It was Jessica who drafted his official statements, crafting them to blur the suspicions without outright confirming or denying them. Her mastery of rhetoric saved Rick from a bigger debacle, but it also further piqued Gabriel's interest. How could someone with such a sketchy professional record have such an uncanny knack for quelling media storms? That same night, after the press conference, Jessica stayed late in the office, almost alone, reviewing reports and preparing Rick's next speech. She felt exhausted, trapped in a whirlwind of events that had spiraled beyond her expectations. Her mother, lying in a hospital bed, the illicit funds she had taken, and the ever-intensifying investigations. As she typed the final lines of a statement, she heard footsteps behind her. It was Gabriel Ferrer, watching her in silence. The glow from the computer screen allowed Jessica to see his distant, calculating expression, and she felt a chill. Before she could speak, he began a subtle interrogation, probing into her past experience in other campaigns and hinting at her sudden financial urgency. Jessica offered carefully crafted evasions, but sensed that Gabriel remained unconvinced. "In an environment like this, we all have secrets, don't you think?" Gabriel said, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. Without waiting for an answer, he left, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt deafening. Jessica realized the net was closing in on her. Not only was she dealing with Cortázar's threats and the risk of being identified as Silvia Contreras' informant, but now Gabriel seemed determined to expose her from within. Exhausted, she gathered her things and hurried out of the building. Through the window, she could see the distant glow of the city lights. Resentment toward Rick mingled with the agony over her mother's condition in her heart. She felt that, in her quest for revenge, she'd followed a path riddled with lies, drawing her dangerously close to the same corruption she so despised. Still, there was no turning back. Her resolve to make Rick pay remained unshaken, though she admitted she might be sacrificing parts of herself along the way. Pulling her jacket tighter against the cold night breeze, she reminded herself she had to endure a bit longer. Elena's fate and her own vengeance depended on it. Very soon, the political game would grow even more ruthless, and Jessica would have to stand firm if she hoped to see her plan through, without letting it destroy her as well. Tension at Rick Brown's campaign bunker multiplied exponentially over the next few days. Leaks of compromising information in the local press became more frequent, and the advisory team teetered on the edge of hysteria. The one who seemed calmest, albeit increasingly astute in his maneuvers, was Gabriel Ferrer. For some time, the campaign manager had been cross-referencing data and reviewing old files, always wearing an inscrutable expression. One night, when most of the staff had already gone home, Gabriel stayed in front of his computer, combing through historical records of complaints that a former lawyer of Rick's had handed him years ago. He'd never really paid much attention to them, assuming they were minor matters or already settled. However, driven by the inconsistencies in Jessica's resume, he delved into every detail. His eyes widened in surprise when he came across a lawsuit for abandonment. 2 decades earlier, a woman named Elena Castro had formally sued Rick Brown for leaving her and her daughter on a highway. The document included testimonies, dates, and references to a young girl named Jessica. The surname didn't match the one Jessica currently used, but the coincidence of names, the approximate age, and other details were enough to set off alarms for Gabriel. Following the trail, Gabriel checked birth records and discovered that Jessica, who now went by Martinez in the campaign, had originally been registered as Brown Castro before a legal change. The discovery left him stunned. Without a second thought, he printed the documents and headed to Jessica's office, determined to demand an explanation. Jessica was still there, stacking press reports. When she saw Gabriel enter, jaw clenched and a stack of papers in hand, she sensed something serious was coming. He threw the documents onto her desk, showing the lawsuit and the old birth certificate, and stared at her, eyes blazing. "Who are you really?" he asked in a harsh whisper. Startled, Jessica realized she had been found out. With her heart in her throat, she confessed part of the truth, that Rick was her biological father, that he had abandoned them when she was a child, and that she had been planning to expose him for years. Gabriel fell silent for several seconds. To her surprise, he didn't react with anger or rush off to inform the candidate. Instead, Gabriel let out a weary sigh. He explained that he himself had become increasingly disillusioned by Rick and Pedro Cortázar's corrupt maneuvers, and that he understood part of Jessica's anger and pain. Although he didn't share her personal desire for revenge, he believed it was time for the truth to come out. Thus, in a conversation marked by hesitation, they reached an agreement. They would work together to bring Rick down, each with their own motives. Jessica would do so to settle an old debt with her past. Gabriel, out of a sense of justice that had grown amid the corruption surrounding him. Meanwhile, Sylvia Contreras pressed on with her own journalistic investigation. The reporter had received several anonymous emails from Jessica, detailing suspicious transfers and fictitious contracts. But Sylvia needed more evidence. Using the leads she had, she discovered Elena's name and, after some digging, learned that she was hospitalized in the city. Seeking discretion, Sylvia obtained permission to enter during restricted visiting hours, claiming she was a reporter interested in public health issues. Convalescent and weak, Elena lacked the strength to hide the truth when Sylvia asked about her connection to Rick. Though she feared for Jessica's safety, Elena confirmed the abandonment they had suffered 20 years ago, providing details of what had happened on that highway. Although she never spoke her daughter's surname aloud, she gave enough information for the journalist to understand Elena's link to the candidate. Feeling a pang in her heart, Sylvia took notes, sensing that this story could shake up the political landscape, provided it was backed up by solid proof. That same evening, when Sylvia met with Elena, Pedro Cortázar intensified his efforts to uncover who was leaking information to the press. His network of contacts had informed him that several media outlets were beginning to name shadowy financiers, and Cortázar knew his reputation hung by a thread. He sent 2 of his trusted men to follow Jessica. People had seen her poking around places she had no business being, and she'd recently had a run-in with a bodyguard. The thugs began to tail her constantly. When she left the hospital after visiting her mother, they followed her in an unmarked SUV. When she headed to the campaign headquarters, they watched from a distance. Jessica felt the pressure mount, unaware that at that very moment, Gabriel Ferrer, having made his discovery, was taking precautions to protect her in case of a direct confrontation. As the net tightened, Jessica and Gabriel finalized their plan. He, as campaign manager, had access to files and recordings that could reveal the bribery and embezzlement scheme orchestrated by Rick and Cortázar. Jessica, on the other hand, had her budding alliance with Sylvia Contreras, who was already preparing a bombshell series of articles. The challenge was to act before Cortázar's men found more clues and took brutal reprisals. The next day, Jessica met with Gabriel in a secluded office, far from prying eyes. There, they reviewed the key documents implicating Rick, signatures on irregular contracts, testimony from fake suppliers, and clear evidence of the money Cortázar was funneling into the campaign in exchange for future favors. Gabriel was visibly shaken as he listened to the full story of Jessica's abandonment. Something inside him trembled when he realized how far his candidate's hypocrisy extended. With tensions running high, they prepared to strike the final blow. Jessica would send the files to Sylvia Contreras, who would verify the authenticity of the evidence and ready it for publication at the most opportune moment. Gabriel, meanwhile, would ensure the journalist had unrestricted access to the press conference and the campaign's internal sources. But time was against them. Cortázar's men wouldn't stop until they found who was feeding the media, and Jessica feared they could turn up at her apartment at any moment, or worse yet, at Elena's hospital room. Even so, neither she nor Gabriel was willing to back down. They knew that if they didn't act quickly, Rick and Cortázar's corruption would be cemented by an electoral victory, crushing any hope for justice. And so, amid a whirlwind of revelations and unexpected alliances, Jessica's plan was on the verge of entering its most dangerous phase. The web of lies she had woven for years was about to unravel, while Cortázar's men loomed menacingly. Yet despite it all, her thirst for revenge and Gabriel's revived sense of justice joined forces to bring the truth to light, so powerful that not even Rick Brown himself could stop them. The night of the major televised debate between Rick Brown and Karl Moran arrived under a cloud of nerves. The main network's conference hall had become a flurry of journalists, camera operators, and political advisors. Jessica and Gabriel Ferrer had worked hard to prepare Rick, rehearsing answers and anticipating Moran's full arsenal of attacks. Outwardly, the goal was simple: solidify Brown's image as the strongest candidate. However, Jessica and Gabriel had a far riskier plan in mind. When Rick appeared on set, the audience's applause blended with supportive cheers and a few boos. Dressed in a flawless suit, he projected confidence. Moran, on the other hand, was firm and somewhat aggressive in his body language, determined to expose any sign of weakness in his opponent. Behind the scenes, Jessica watched with a serious expression. She could practically feel Rick's tension as he took his place at the podium. This was the last chance to gain or lose voters before the election. Backstage, Gabriel finished coordinating final details: the signal to interrupt if there were any technical issues, and the strategy to steer away from uncomfortable topics. Both knew Rick's reputation was hanging by a thread, especially after corruption reports had begun to circulate. Even so, their plan was to let him shine just enough, and then strike a blow that would leave him reeling in the public eye. The debate's first segment dealt with security, economics, and social programs. The moderator first gave the floor to Karl Moran, who attacked Brown's credibility relentlessly. He accused him of empty promises and demanded to know where his campaign's massive funding was coming from. Rick, meticulously trained by Jessica, responded cautiously, recalling every scripted phrase they had practiced. He even introduced some emotional anecdotes to connect with the audience, partly neutralizing Moran's offensive and evening out the atmosphere in the studio. Throughout the exchange, Sylvia Contreras, the journalist invited as a panelist, listened in silence, studying each gesture and jotting down notes in a small notebook. When the moderator opened the question round for the press, Sylvia took the microphone and addressed Rick directly. She asked a pointed question about the relationship between his campaign and a certain businessman named Pedro Cortázar, who had recently been implicated in possible financial crimes. At the mere mention of his name, Rick's face subtly tightened. "There are rumors your team has received millions in funding from unclear sources," Sylvia said firmly. "Can you clarify those connections and guarantee there's no corruption involved?" Rick, though uneasy, was prepared thanks to Jessica's coaching. With a slight smile, he denied any shady links, insisting everything was transparently documented. He portrayed Cortázar as merely one of many sponsors interested in the state's progress. For a moment, the audience appeared convinced. However, Sylvia produced a printed document showing some partial transactions, implying certain payments that didn't appear in the official financial records. A palpable tension filled the air. Silence settled over the studio while viewers watched Rick discreetly wipe sweat from his brow. Nevertheless, he regained his composure, launching into the evasive statement he had rehearsed. He claimed ignorance of the transfers and promised to investigate any irregularities if confirmed. The divided audience responded with murmurs, and Moran seized the chance to make sarcastic remarks. Sensing the intensity, the moderator cut off the topic and moved on to the next segment. The result? The debate remained without a clear winner, though Rick's image clearly emerged with new cracks. In the final stretch, each candidate delivered a closing statement, promising a better future and appealing for public trust. When the cameras went off, a collective relief spread among everyone present. Beneath the surface, however, a crucial move was being orchestrated. In a hidden hallway of the studio, Sylvia Contreras briefly met with Jessica and Gabriel, where they handed over the last piece of evidence. The original complaint filed by Elena, documenting the roadside abandonment, and a video featuring a witness who confirmed Rick as the man who had left his family unprotected. Sylvia examined the documents in astonishment, realizing their magnitude. They not only highlighted Rick's corruption, but also his lack of humanity in abandoning his daughter and the child's mother. With these papers, the story would become a national scandal capable of completely derailing Brown's candidacy. That night, Sylvia returned to her newsroom knowing that the next broadcast would be an explosive event. She possessed the missing piece to bring down the most popular politician of the moment. Jessica and Gabriel went their separate ways after giving Sylvia the documentation. He lingered, reflecting on the consequences of what they had just done. His career as campaign manager would almost certainly end, but he could no longer stomach the corruption he had witnessed firsthand. Overcome by emotion, Jessica felt tears threaten to escape as she thought of her mother in the hospital. She had come this far, and for the first time, she felt genuine fear at the prospect of Rick's imminent downfall. Still, the resentment that had driven her all these years remained steadfast. Outside the network building, Rick emerged surrounded by advisors, fielding reporters' questions under a barrage of microphones and cameras. He appeared satisfied at having survived the debate, convinced that his explanations had been enough to stave off any scandal. Unbeknownst to him, though, the real blow was mere hours away, courtesy of his own daughter, whom he had rejected, and an unexpected ally who had grown sick of the corruption. The finale loomed over them like an unyielding storm. The debate had ended in a deadlock, yet Rick's credibility had already begun to waver, and his most devastating disgrace had yet to be revealed. The public sensed that something bigger was about to erupt, and all eyes turned expectantly to Sylvia Contreras, the journalist about to carry the truth into every corner. Days later. It was 6 in the morning when Sylvia Contreras's report finally came to light. First, it aired on the most watched morning news broadcast, and as soon as it finished, it spread like wildfire across the major online news outlets. The footage was devastating. Excerpts of documents linking Rick Brown and Pedro Cortázar appeared, showing multiple bank transfers of questionable origin. There was also a brief video clip of a highway witness who, 20 years ago, had seen Elena and little Jessica being abandoned. The report was accompanied by recordings of interviews with accountants and public officials who, under anonymity, confirmed the illegal favors propping up Rick's campaign. The impact was immediate. People everywhere, from public transportation to offices and coffee shops, stood frozen before the screens playing the news. The morning show hosts were relentless. Minute by minute, they revealed more and more evidence exposing the scale of the corruption. Journalist Sylvia Contreras appeared on screen, serious and composed, holding up the files that showed how Rick had received hefty bribes from Cortázar in exchange for awarding inflated contracts if he came to power. Social media erupted in a wave of reactions. Hashtags like Brown Corrupto and Abandono Imperdonable shot to the top of the national trending lists. Memes and critical comments multiplied at breakneck speed. No official statements emerged from Rick's campaign, and confusion reigned among his staff. Everyone tried to contact the candidate who, reeling, demanded answers while rushing to his main office. Meanwhile, Pedro Cortázar faced his own crisis. Authorities, alerted by the magnitude of the scandal, launched formal investigations against him. Anti-corruption agents descended on one of his shell companies to gather evidence of money laundering. Realizing how quickly things were spiraling out of control, Cortázar fled, or at least took refuge in a secure location until the uproar died down. No one managed to locate him all morning, and rumors suggested he might have taken a plane to an unknown destination. At campaign headquarters, chaos was absolute. Advisors who had once displayed undying loyalty to Brown began packing up their belongings. Others, fearful of being embroiled in the scandal, severed ties with the campaign immediately. Several public figures who had supported Rick up until then issued statements denying any connection to him. Overnight, the once powerful candidate turned into a political pariah, someone very few were willing to defend. Amid this tumult, Jessica stood in a corner of the office, watching the implosion she had triggered. Her original intention was to expose the truth and exact some measure of compensation for the pain Rick had caused her. Yet seeing the aftermath unsettled her. The bunker doors were opening and slamming shut, people were yelling into phones, and the once pristine hallways now resembled a battleground littered with boxes and scattered documents. Deep down, she felt a nearly painful sense of relief. The secrets had finally emerged, but with a violence she hadn't fully anticipated. The family confrontation came swiftly. Adriana, furious and humiliated, burst into Rick's office the moment the candidate returned. Julius and Alice followed her, both looking pale. Waving the printout of the lead story in her hand, Rick's wife confronted him. "How could you keep from me that you had another daughter?" she demanded. Rick mumbled vague explanations, trying to blame the press for defaming his image. But Adriana cut him off, listing the damning evidence presented in the report: the illicit transfers, the testimony confirming the abandonment, and the witness who backed up every detail. In one strike, all Rick's carefully woven lies unraveled. Eyes brimming with anger, Julius asked him outright if Jessica was indeed their half-sister. His voice trembled, unable to process the deception forced on them. Alice, even more distraught, sank into a nearby chair and covered her face, feeling used, betrayed. Learning that their father had once abandoned a daughter on a dusty highway utterly destroyed her perception of him. Rick could only keep denying it in a shaky voice, but there was no escape. The evidence spoke for itself. Adriana's fury reached a boiling point as she realized she had been deceived for years. With a fierce slam of the door, she declared she never wanted to see him again. Julius, unable to contain his anger, shouted that he would never forgive him, then left the office after his mother. Alice, eyes brimming with tears, simply gave him a look of utter disappointment before following her brother out. From that moment on, Rick's downfall accelerated precipitously. As the day wore on, media outlets replayed Sylvia Contreras' findings endlessly. Every new broadcast revealed another piece of the story, another receipt for illegal transactions, a new statement from neighbors who recalled Elena and Jessica's impoverished life after being abandoned. Nothing remained hidden. Brown's face, once a symbol of hope for certain voters, became the epitome of political hypocrisy. Polls that had shown Rick in the lead suddenly plummeted at an alarming speed. Voters dismissed him as a viable option, while Karl Moran capitalized on the situation, presenting himself as the ethical, transparent candidate. In less than 24 hours, Brown's advantage vanished, and Moran took the top spot. That afternoon, Jessica walked out of the building that had once symbolized her mission for vengeance. She felt no celebration, no triumphant shouts, only a knot in her throat. She drew a deep breath, remembering Elena's look from her hospital bed, Julius and Alice's stunned faces, and even the spark of disappointment in Adriana's eyes. In her quest to dismantle Rick, she had also shattered the lives of people who had never imagined such betrayal. Even so, her objective had been achieved. Rick was exposed before the entire country, his reputation in ruins. Cortázar had fled, and any remaining allies were fleeing in fear of being implicated themselves. The Brown name, once tied to a promising political rise, was now a living testament to how ambition and cruelty can destroy a family. As the day drew to a close, Jessica gazed up at the red-streaked sky. Almost wistfully, she remembered the 5-year-old girl who had sobbed on a dusty highway, unable to understand why her father was leaving. Now she understood it all. Rick was not worthy of being called a father. With a sigh filled with both relief and sorrow, she headed to the hospital, conscious that her next step would be to start a new chapter in her life. For now, though, the media explosion was well underway, and the vengeance she had awaited for so long was materializing on the worst day of Rick Brown's life. The news of Rick Brown's electoral defeat arrived in a terse announcement from the Electoral Authority. His candidacy had lost resoundingly to Karl Moran's. Over the following days, the media chronicled the dizzying downfall of a man who, until recently, had embodied the hope of a fresh start for the state. Now, however, he was dealing with corruption lawsuits, leaked illegal contracts, and the looming threat of criminal charges. For Rick, it all happened with the same brutality he had shown when he shattered Elena and Jessica's lives 2 decades earlier. He had scheduled appearances before the public prosecutor, and his former collaborators avoided him so they wouldn't be tainted by the scandal. As for Pedro Cortázar, he was still on the run. Authorities were tracing his financial moves to determine the scope of the money laundering scheme that had tied the two men together. Meanwhile, Elena's life took a significant turn. Though still recovering in the hospital, she received a visit from lawyers presenting a legal agreement. They explained that Rick had been forced to negotiate a settlement in exchange for Elena withdrawing some of the pending civil lawsuits against him. The document included a substantial compensation package, enough to cover the medical treatment required by her heart condition. At first, Jessica balked at accepting any money from Rick, but Elena's health was the priority, and her mother, in her calm, steady way, reminded her that it wasn't about corruption, but rather a minimum measure of restitution for all the harm they had endured. After much hesitation, Jessica signed the papers, hoping that at least the money would grant Elena a chance to recover and put the years of hardship behind her. Doctors confirmed that with proper treatment and a complex surgical procedure, Elena could lead an almost normal life. Thus began her rehabilitation in a more optimistic atmosphere than ever before. Jessica accompanied her to every appointment, feeling that at last the wound they had carried since being abandoned on that dusty highway was beginning to heal. Meanwhile, the dynamic in the Brown household changed completely. Adriana, reeling from public humiliation and from the betrayal that Jessica's existence entailed, left the house with her children. After several days of volatile arguments with Rick, she made the decision to move somewhere far from the media storm surrounding him. Julius and Alice followed her without question, unable to forgive their father for the deceit and pain they'd discovered. Nonetheless, it wasn't all utter destruction. Amid the fallout, Jessica had a brief meeting with Julius and Alice. They regarded her with mixed feelings, curiosity, resentment, and at the same time, a certain empathy for her story. Jessica spoke with them about the loneliness she and Elena had endured and what had driven her to act. Her half-siblings, through silences and attempts at understanding, agreed to keep in touch in the future, though nothing was certain yet. Their bond was only just emerging, and their anger toward Rick still lingered, but it was a first step toward building a relationship different from the one he had left them. On another note, Sylvia Contreras emerged as the most celebrated journalist of the moment. Her report, backed by impeccable evidence and testimonies, became a touchstone for discussing the fight against corruption. Job offers poured in from national media outlets, and she was invited to appear on high-profile shows. Though she was grateful for the recognition, in her heart she knew that the real protagonist of this story was Jessica, the woman who had risked everything to expose her own father's crimes. On the day Elena was finally discharged from the hospital, Jessica accompanied her to a larger, better-equipped apartment. It was modest, but far more dignified than their previous home. There, the two of them began a period of calm and recovery. Elena still needed regular checkups, but her demeanor radiated a hope that had been absent for so long. One afternoon, while they were sorting boxes, Jessica stumbled on an old photograph, a blurry image of her and her mother at the beach when she was only 5. A wave of nostalgia squeezed her chest as she recalled all that had transpired since then. She sat down next to Elena, studying the photo in silence. The little girl captured in that picture seemed to belong to another world, a world where there were no betrayals or vendettas. That moment turned into a symbolic closure for both of them. They held the photograph for a while, remembering better days and feeling grateful that, at least, they still had each other. Jessica understood that, although her father would finally pay for his actions, the real victory for her and her mother lay in breaking free, once and for all, from that cycle of pain. Hours later, as night fell, Jessica stepped out onto the balcony and breathed in the cool air with a hint of serenity. Inside her, she still bore the indelible scar of abandonment, but she also carried the strength of someone who dared to confront her past. She reflected on the emotional toll of justice and revenge. She had lost part of herself in the process, but she had gained the chance to live without chains, without having to bottle up every tear. And so concluded the story that had shaped 2 decades of her life. Disgraced and alone, Rick Brown vanished from the political stage, left with only the echoes of his mistakes. Jessica and Elena, on the other hand, closed the wound for good, determined not to let hatred guide their steps any longer. They still had a future to build, and for the first time in a long while, they gazed forward, knowing that although vengeance had delivered a form of justice, it would not be the guiding star of their lives anymore. That guiding star would be the freedom to start anew. The story of Jessica and Elena reminds us that resentment, though it can fuel the pursuit of justice, exacts a profound emotional toll. After a long journey of deception and sacrifice, both women discover that true relief lies in letting go of hatred's burden. As for Rick, once perched atop power and arrogance, he is ultimately consumed by his own wrongdoing, paying the price for his abandonment and corruption. In the end, this story shows us that revenge achieves its full impact only when the truth comes to light, and that genuine freedom is found not in the act of revenge itself, but in the ability to heal from past wounds, allow room for forgiveness, and forge a new beginning. And that's where our story ends. Thank you so much for joining me. If you enjoyed it, give me a like, subscribe, and share so our community can grow. See you soon.